All right, so what we're going to discuss tonight is something which is of great relevance, despite the fact it's an event that occurred probably, 350 years ago in the town of Westphalia. It was the agreement that ended an event which is known to us today as the 30 Years' War. And it's called the 30 Years' War because it was a 30-year period, but of a much longer war. Actually, if you want to know the origin of this, it goes back to the period at the end of the 15th century with the beginning of the Inquisition in Spain. The decision to throw the Jews out of Spain and then the Muslims, which was a beginning period of a clash, an early clash of civilizations, you might call it, which was run directly by the faction in the church, the Christian church at the time, that was run by the Venetians. And it was a direct assault on the idea of the nation state. Because you had in the 15th century an extraordinary development, the development of the modern, what we call today the nation state. The idea that governments, instead of treating their citizens as the equivalent of cattle or serfs or slaves, but the idea that a government or a nation can improve its circumstances for all its population as a way of increasing the power of the nation. And the first of the modern nation states was that set up by Louis XI in France in 1461. And the second nation state was that which was created by the overthrow of Richard III by Henry Tudor, who became known as Henry VII, the person who initiated the Tudor Renaissance in England. And it's important to note that the establishment of nation states coincided with the idea of scientific renaissance and a cultural renaissance. The Renaissance referring in particular to the rebirth of the ideas of Plato and the pre-Socratic and the Socratic Greeks, both in terms of art, the classical method of composition of ideas, the Socratic dialogue as a principle for expanding knowledge, and with Nicholas of Cusa, the figure who was most responsible for trying to unify the Christian church with the 1439 Council of Florence, who was also the founder of modern science. And so the idea that you would have a cultural renaissance, a scientific renaissance, with a perfect example of that being Leonardo da Vinci, that would as well revolutionize the social relations within a state and organize a whole new form of political existence called the nation state. This is what was occurring in the 15th century. And it threatened completely the control of the oligarchy, the financial powers of the time, which was centered largely in Venice, which controlled the Mediterranean and controlled trade routes and so on. And so this was, Lyndon LaRouche often talks about what he calls the long arc of history, and the fact that there exist arcs within these. And sometimes I know you start questioning, well, what do you mean by a long arc? But the arcs actually define the fight for hegemony of two conflicting worldviews. In the one case, the Platonic or Socratic worldview, which actually goes back, it predates Socrates, the idea of spherics, the revolution in astrophysical observation, which was the beginning of modern science. But at the same time, the alternate view, that which is largely identified with the Aristotelians, or in modern terms, the Newtonians. But the main difference between them, one that believed in the perfectibility of the powers of the human being, that man had a capacity to uncover the physical principles which are responsible for the construction of our universe, and to use those discovery of universal physical principles to improve the conditions of man. That's the Platonic conception, the idea that you have to search for truth, but truth is ultimately knowable. but only by constantly overturning what you think you know as truth, as opposed to the Aristotelians whose view toward truth was, we can't really know. There's only so much we can know. We can't know fundamental causes. We can't know the principles. All we can know is the effects. And therefore, you're limiting from the start, the degree to which you can pursue truth. And once you make a compromise with that, once you say, well, truth, maybe it's out there, but maybe it's really not. Maybe what I think is true for me is really what's true. And of course, you can make arguments to show how silly that view is. But what happens if that view is the view of the dominant powers in the world? If it's reinforced by the teachings of the church? If you go against the teachings of the church, you might experience what it's like to be a toasted marshmallow. Because that's what the Inquisition is all about. Oh, you think there's a truth other than what we say? Well, we'd like to hear about that. Come on over here and we'll build a bonfire and we'll discuss it while your body is melting. Because there's only one truth, and it's the laws, the doctrine that are imposed by the powers to be. And of course, the church and civil society had an alliance in the form of monarchs and feudal rulers who used the power of the church to suppress people, to keep people backwards, to keep them like serfs and slaves. And so the modern nation state was a fundamental revolution against that. And with the emergence of France and England in the 15th century and an anti-Venetian alliance, the power of Venice was threatened fundamentally. And by 1510, a decision was made to launch the wars of religion, to keep people fighting each other over the specific doctrines, how you worship Jesus, how you believe in Jesus, how you say the prayers, whether you have Jesus' body on the cross or not on the cross when you worship, and so on. Now, today, you can go down the street here and you see a Catholic church, and across the street is a Protestant church. That didn't exist in the early days. In fact, the early breakthrough, the breakup of the church with Martin Luther in Germany, and then a decade later, Henry VIII, breaking with Rome and establishing his own English church, the Church of England. In England, from 1527 up through the time of Queen Elizabeth, up through 1587, you had, when Henry was in power, he suppressed and killed Catholics. When his Catholic daughter, Mary Tudor, became queen, she became known as Bloody Mary because she killed Protestants. And when Elizabeth, the Protestant daughter of Henry Tudor, Henry VIII, who had many wives, when his Protestant daughter Elizabeth came to power, they started killing Catholics. On the continent, it was worse. Constant warfare starting in 1618, with what's one of my favorite events because of its name, the Defenestration of Prague, which basically meant some guy who was a collector for the Catholic Church was thrown out a window. And that launched what became the 30 Years' War. Now, in 1618, they didn't call it the 30 Years' War. Because when you talk about the arcs of history, there's no predetermined arc that's embedded in time. What determines the arcs in history is the battle of ideas. What determines whether you have a 30 Years' War or a 5 Years' War, or a 100 Years' War, which is essentially what Bush is talking about, and Rumsfeld and Cheney. What determines that is what the people who are usually the victims of these wars decide. Right now, we're on the verge of World War III. Will there be a World War III? Who's going to determine that? Bush? In Bush's mind, he's already in World War III. In his mind, there was the First World War, there was the Second World War, there now is World War III, and there will be no further world wars because Jesus will come at the end of this one. And I kid you not, there's an element in Bush's thinking, which is that this is the final war, the horseman on the apocalypse. He probably is dreaming at night. Laura has to shake him awake and says, George, it's not happening yet. Calm down. You haven't been raptured, George. You have to get up and go to work again in the morning. I mean, I think there's a reason he goes to sleep at 9 o'clock at night. It's so Laura can do some reading late at night. You know, he walks around the house probably saying, hard work, September the 11th, and so on. So we're on the verge of a World War III. We're already in the opening stages of that. We're also in the opening stages of the next great world financial breakdown. You know, so 20 years from now, you can look back and say, all right, let's just say 1971 was the beginning of that financial breakdown. And maybe we'll say 1991 was the beginning of World War III. How long did they go? So we're already in the arcs that are moving in those directions. 1971 we know with absolute certainty, because that was the year the decision was made to destroy the Bretton Woods system. And one of the key people in making that decision, George Shultz, who convinced John Connally, the hapless Secretary of State, the big bad Texan, he convinced Connally to go in and tell Nixon to take the dollar off gold and to end the fixed exchange rates. That same Shultz is the guy who chose Arnold Schwarzenegger to be governor of California. He's the same guy in 1998 who told Republicans George W. Bush is presidential timber, because he's got about as much brains as a toothpick. Now, he's the one who said, we can trust Bush, we can go with Bush. Shultz is the person who works together to direct Dick Cheney. Shultz of Bechtel, of which Halliburton of Cheney is a partner. Shultz of the Bohemian Grove in Stanford. That's the George Shultz who in 1971 started the course of the economic disintegration, with the idea being that 1971 was the beginning of what we call today globalization. And globalization is a fancy $12 term for destroying the nation state. The idea, no nation states. No government should get in the way of the cartels, of the private sector. It's the private sector über alles. And this policy that became the global policy in 1971 actually has its origins in a philosophy known as synarchism. And the synarchists were the father of the fascists who were brought to power in the 1920s and 30s in Europe. What was the policy of the Nazis? What was the policy of the Francoists? It was to allow the cartels to run the government, the financial cartels. Who put Hitler in power? The German people? Never more than a third of them ever voted for him. He was brought in a secret conspiracy through the aging and demented President Hindenburg, whose son, working with Schroeder Bank, working with Hjalmar Schacht of the Liberal Democratic Party, under direction from Montague Norman in the Bank of England, brought Hitler in to impose what we know today as fascist economic policy. It was globalization. It was the cartels, the insurance companies, the shipping companies, the banks, Standard Oil with E.G. Farben, Thyssen Steel financed by Harriman Brothers. And slave labor is a part of that. Destroy the protection that the nation state gives to its workers. You go back to what I said about Louis XI in the 1460s. What did he say? If you educate the people, they become more productive. If they think there's no difference between themselves and cows, they'll go out in the field and produce a certain amount of a crop. If you use their minds, so they start looking at what it is that increases crop yields, what increases the production of dairy products. If you give them that power, they become more productive. The whole state benefits. If you keep them as dumb serfs, and if they get out of line, you kill them, then it's easier to keep control. That's what fascism is. It was a modern form of feudalism. And that's what Schultz tried to impose, and he's been largely successful in his attacks on the nation state. So successful that if you take an economics class in campuses today, such as Pepperdine or Claremont, or especially Claremont, but even USC or UCLA, what is economics? This is the fundamental axiom, globalization. The nation state is a 19th or 18th century concept. It's an impediment to free trade. It's an impediment to producing more wealth. That's what they teach you. And you could ask them, well, what about what Roosevelt did during the New Deal? Oh, that was 18th century methods. Now, globalization is actually 14th century methods. The first anti-globalists were Louis XI of France and Henry VII of England. And Henry VII had a good idea. He said, look, let's not just build up a real economy. Let's bring in the smartest people in Europe. Let's bring the Platonists over to London. Take Oxford away from the reactionary clerics and turn it over to the Erasmians. That was the whole idea. Thomas More, Colet, these were people who brought Plato to London. So this idea of the nation state has always been targeted. Now, what I want to do is just demonstrate then what happened with Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, to show you what has to happen today to avoid World War III. Because you're always dealing in a fight between the idea of a nation state based on the development of the creative powers of every person in the population, with the concepts of economic justice, the concepts of universal education, versus the idea of synarchy or globalization, that there's going to be an elite that controls the ideas, and there's always going to be a vast majority of the population that will, in the modern terms, be turned into consumers who are manipulated by the globalists. And you can control the tastes of the consumers through computer games, through television, through movies, through mass media and entertainment, so that the consumers are no longer capable of thinking as citizens of a nation. They think mainly on what will please me today, what will ease my boredom today. Oh, you want to talk about poverty in Africa? Well, gee, that's too bad. Why don't we send them computers? Maybe if they had Carjack 6 available in the river states of Nigeria, they'd overcome their concerns with children dying of diseases in early childhood. So we have to elevate the thinking of people the way it occurred in 1648. Now, what happened in 1648? That was at the end of one of these arcs. 30 years of fighting in Germany, in Austria, in Poland. Horrible destruction. Hordes of people moving from one town to the next. Once you destroy the countryside in one area, it wasn't just the army that moved, all the people had to move because there was no longer any food. And after this continued on, a figure in France, Cardinal Mazarin, whose most famous protege, many of you know from his collaboration with Leibniz and Huygens, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Mazarin pulled together a conference which led to the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. And they drafted a fairly extraordinary document. I just want to read you a couple quotes from it. Now remember, there had been the Holy Roman Empire against various German princes, against the King of Sweden, against the various Polish nobility, against the French, against the Austrians. Just slaughter for 30 years. People really didn't like each other. The Protestants and the Catholics did not get along. And at the end of this, they said, this peace, which must be a permanent peace, one of true and honest friendship between all people involved. And this peace must be so honest and seriously guarded and nourished that each part furthers the advantage honor, and benefit of the other. The idea of benefiting the other, not just saying, we hate you, you hate us, let's just stop fighting. Let's just lay down our arms. We'll watch you put your swords down, we'll put our swords down, and that guy over there picked his sword up again. So we've got to attack. No, the idea of forgiveness. And Article 2 of the treaty says this: on both sides, all should be forever forgotten and forgiven. All should be forever forgotten and forgiven. What has from the beginning of the unrest, no matter how or where, from one side or the other, happened in terms of hostility, so that neither because of that nor because of any other reason or pretext should commit or allow to happen any hostility, unfriendliness, difficulty, or obstacle in respect to persons, the status, goods, or security, and on and on. Instead, all and every, from here as well as from there, both before as well as during the war, committed insults, violent acts, hostilities, damages, and costs, without regard to the person or the issue, should be completely put aside, so that everything, whatever the one could demand from the other under his name, will be forgotten in eternity. Now, think about that for a moment. Think about your high school rival. Think about the grudge you had with someone in high school. They spread a rumor against you. They gossiped against you. They got you in trouble with the principal, or with your parents, or with your girlfriend, or your boyfriend, or both. They smeared your name, and you will forever be their enemy. You'll in turn gossip about them. Now, this may seem trivial, but think of the state of mind. Did anybody in here have that kind of grudge against anyone in high school or college? All right, one person in the back. And we'll not flash any gang signs around him because that will... No, of course, all of you have that. Most of you have it with someone in this room. I won't mention any names, but there is the tall redhead devil. That many of you have a grudge against. Don't put me on a squad with him. If you put me on a squad with him, I'm not going out to deploy. He stole my best contact. And on and on and on. So just think about it. I'm trivializing it, but it's actually true. Now, imagine if the red-headed devil had actually not liked the way you were singing in the third register and cut your head off. Imagine the effect that that would have in terms of interpersonal relations. I'm not going into his sectional. He's serious. Last person that couldn't hit that fa sharp got his head cut off. So when you say all should be forever forgotten and forgiven, all those who raped and pillaged and stole and killed, who slaughtered your children, killed your grandparents, stole your land, stole your food, denounced you and killed you and trampled on you because of your religion. As of this day, it shall all be forgotten forever, for eternity. Should be completely put aside and will be forgotten in eternity. Now that's the idea of the Westphalian principle. Now, let's go several hundred years later, from 1648 to 1948. Something happened in 1948 which has represented a turning point in the area of the world we call the Middle East. It was on May 14th, 1948, that the State of Israel was declared an independent sovereign state under the auspices of a vote at the United Nations in November 1947. Now, there were supposed to be two states declared on that day, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, a Zionist state, an Israeli state. And yet, because of internal faction fights among the Arab world, there was a refusal to accept the idea of a Jewish state. I might add as well, there was also there were disputes in the Jewish community. The Orthodox Jews, the real Orthodox Jews, refused to acknowledge the establishment of a Jewish state because they said, according to Scripture, you cannot have a Jewish state. The state of Israel will not come into existence until the Messiah has returned. And the Orthodox Jews who opposed the establishment of Israel in May 1948 did not consider David Ben-Gurion or any of the leaders of Israel to be the Messiah. You still have a faction within the serious Orthodox Jewry today which doesn't recognize the state of Israel. So there was a fight over whether Israel should be recognized, and the Arab states launched a war to stop it. And Israel won that war. And in winning that war, the forces of Israel, in order to ensure security, drove a number of the Palestinians, and some will say the Palestinians fled, some will say they were driven. Whatever actually occurred, and there's evidence of both. There were cases where the armed forces of Israel drove Palestinians from their homes, destroyed the homes. There's a very interesting book by a former official of the city of Jerusalem, David Ben-Venisti, who writes that his father was actually involved in redrawing maps of Israel after 1950 to leave out all the old Palestinian cities. And so that you could do archaeological digs and find a city that no longer existed on the maps that were made by Ben-Venisti after 1950. But whether the Palestinians were driven, and there were acts of terror committed by Israeli forces, or whether they fled, or whether they were told to flee by the Arabs, what happened is the State of Israel established its control over a certain amount of land that was part of the original mandate. Now, what happened from 1948 up to 1967 is you had another war in 56. You had a lot of back and forth fighting. You had a number of resolutions and arguments and disputes that are not worth going through for the purposes of this discussion. But in 1967, Israel launched a very rapid attack, preemptive attack, you might say, the Six-Day War, which culminated in the taking of Jerusalem, the whole of the West Bank, and Gaza. And there was a dispute at that time among Israelis. Since Gaza was mostly Palestinian, since the West Bank is largely Palestinian, the West Bank had been under Jordanian control. But then the Israelis took it. And Jerusalem, the whole of the Holy City, was now under Israeli control. Should that be held by the Israelis? Jerusalem, which is the third holiest city to Muslims. But also it's holy to Jews and it's holy to Christians. All of this, as you know who heard my class previously, all of this was set up by the British. The fighting, the manipulation, the religious warfare goes back to the decision made at the end of the 19th century to have the Holy Land turned into an ongoing battle, not so different from what existed with the early Crusades. So the question that was posed after 67 is, what do the Israelis do with this land they've conquered, which is primarily peopled by Palestinians? Now, in many cases going back to 1948, Palestinians who lost their land, who were not allowed to go to Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Lebanon, were moved into what became known as refugee camps. Most of these refugee camps still exist to the present day. There are people who go back to 1948, 3 generations, who grew up, 2 generations that grew up in these camps, with their bitterness, their anger. And occasionally that anger would spill out and they would kill a Jewish settler. And there would be anger from the Jewish side. Because a part of what existed in Israel, a very big part, was the idea that there had to be a land for the Jewish people because of what happened in Germany with the Holocaust. Now, I don't want to get into the whole argument on that, but there's a fascinating book by Tom Segev called The Seventh Million, which is about the internal fights within Judaism over how to interpret the Holocaust. Because the argument is, look, as bad as 2,000 years outside of Israel, outside of the Palestine, has been for the Jews, the clearly most tragic aspect was the slaughter of Jews by the Nazis. That being driven out of your homeland for 2,000 years is bad enough, but if it culminates in a deliberate destruction, what could be worse than that? And therefore, didn't the world owe the Jews a homeland? Now again, as I pointed out earlier, the Nazis were not primarily a bunch of anti-Semitic thugs, although a lot of the people in the SS and SA and Hitler himself were. But the Nazis were put in power for another reason entirely. But actually the slaughter of Jews, and many non-Jews, by the way, was part of that. It was the destruction of the idea of man that existed in German culture. Because one of the questions that comes up, especially among Jews, is Germany was the most cultured place in Europe. And because of Moses Mendelssohn and the Jewish Enlightenment at the end of the 19th or 18th century, by the 1900s, the Jews were had virtual independence in Germany. There were Jewish professors, Jewish lawyers, Jewish merchants, Jewish bankers. There was an integration of the Jews in Germany unlike anywhere else in Europe. In World War I, the most loyal German soldiers were the German Jews, partly because they opposed Russia, where the Jewish people were the victims consistently of pogroms and oppression. So how in a civilized country like Germany could the Jews have been slaughtered? Worse than people would treat animals. And so the argument grew up, as Segev documents, among key people in Israel, that now that there's a Jewish homeland that came out of this suffering, and you could ask the question, why would God allow his chosen people to be submitted to this kind of suffering? Why? And for many people in Israel, there's literally a secular religious belief, a secular theology, which is that because of that suffering, the Jews have the right to do whatever is necessary to defend their homeland. Now, this is one of the big debates in Israel, because the founding fathers, Ben Gurion and others, wanted a Jewish state to be like any other state. They wanted a democratic state, but they wanted Jews to be free in that state. But they didn't wish to oppress others. The problem was that when you began at the end of World War I, there were about 60,000, actually by then there were about 100,000, 120,000 Jews, and about 600,000 non-Jewish Palestinians, Christians and Muslims. So how could you make it a Jewish state? So during the course of this period during the 1940s, the question then for the Jews is, do we get a state or do we remain part of a British entity? And Ben Gurion was appealing to the British, while his main opponent in the Jewish world, Jabotinsky, was appealing to Hitler. Jabotinsky said in the 1930s mid-1930s to Hitler, if you drop your anti-Semitism, we Jews will support your fascist policies. And we'll join you against Britain. Jabotinsky's newspaper. Jabotinsky founded what was called revisionist Judaism. And the party set up by Jabotinsky today is the Likud party of Netanyahu. And the chief operator for Jabotinsky in the United States, one of his chief lieutenants in the United States, was Ben Zion Netanyahu, the father of Benjamin Netanyahu in the Likud today. And Jabotinsky said, we must put our heels on the throats of the Arab population in Palestine and get them to submit to us. Once they do that, this was called the Iron Wall policy. It was his theory. He wrote it. He said, once they do that, once they submit, then we'll allow them to live with us. Now, in the Arab world, you had the head of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Husseini, came to Nazi Germany and collaborated with Hitler. He said the Arabs should join Hitler in wiping out the Jews. So you had a religious warfare from Europe brought into Palestine during World War II. If you go back 100 years, you find that under the Ottoman Empire, the Jews and the non-Jews among the Palestinians lived poorly but relatively peacefully. They weren't fighting. They weren't killing each other. They had no aspirations for a state. They were under the Ottoman Empire. So what happened after 1948 was with the establishment of a state and the fight to establish a Palestinian state, which actually began especially after 1967 with the takeover, the so-called occupied territories, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it. That's when the real hostilities began. You had the development of Fatah under the Palestine Liberation Organization, which believed in terrorism against the Jews. And their argument was, well, isn't this what the Jews did against the British? And you know what? It's true. In fact, one of the leaders of the Likud, a man named Yitzhak Shamir, who became prime minister in the late 1970s, or the early 80s rather, up through 92, Shamir was part of a group called the Stern Gang, which assassinated Count Bernadotte, who was the UN envoy to Palestine in 1947. He also was part of the group that blew up the King David Hotel, which killed about 80 people. So, yes, there were Jewish terrorists. Now, did that justify terrorism against the Jews? No terrorism in this kind of situation is justified. You can come up with arguments for it, but it was, in a sense, asymmetric warfare. Interestingly, there were times when the Arab population and the Jewish population would be shooting each other. The British would show up. They'd stop shooting each other. They'd both shoot at the British. Then the Brits would leave and they'd start shooting at each other again. Now, after 1967, this changed. The focus became the defense of the Jewish state against the Palestinians. And the Palestinian view at that time, the charter of the PLO, was drive the Jews out of Israel completely. So there's not much of a middle ground there. There was a follow-up war in 1973 when Israel was attacked from all sides, and Israel was caught off guard. They nearly lost the war. They turned it around fairly quickly, and as they were moving toward Damascus and Cairo, the U.S. forced them to stop. And from 1973 to the present, you had a series of efforts back and forth at peace and war. There was 1979, the Camp David Agreement, where the Sinai was given back to the Egyptians. And Sadat, in turn, recognized Israel. And then Anwar Sadat was murdered by Islamic terrorists. You had the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 because of the Palestinians who were largely camped in southern Lebanon. Occasionally, they'd lob a grenade into Israel. And so Begin, who was a Likud member, a Jabotinskyite, Begin ordered Sharon to go in and clean it out, and Sharon went all the way up to Beirut. And that was the beginning of an 18-year occupation by the Israelis of southern Lebanon, with some major atrocities. The murder of close to 2,000, mostly children, women, and elderly, at the Palestinian camps at Sabra and Shatila, where Sharon's troops opened the door for the Lebanese Christian militia to go in and take out their vengeance on Palestinians. You had constant Palestinian fighting against the northern settlements in North Israel on the Lebanon border. You had the Intifada then, which began in 1987, December 1987. An Intifada means resistance. And what happened really is you had young children, Palestinian children, who decided to confront Israeli tanks and Israeli soldiers with rocks and bottles and whatever they could find to throw at them. The person who was brought in at that time, Shamir was the prime minister. The defense minister was Rabin. You had a Likud-Labor coalition. And Shamir asked Rabin, as the defense minister, to suppress the rebellion. And Rabin's initial orders to the troops were break their bones, just do it off camera. We've got to demoralize them. Only Rabin discovered that the people getting demoralized were the Israeli soldiers. According to Rabin's wife, he realized that Jews were not made to occupy other people. And he came to realize in that period, 88, 89, that this was a mistake. You couldn't defeat the Palestinians by breaking the bones of their children. All you do is increase the opposition. Now, it was in that context that the fight really took off, because Shamir was a hardliner. Shamir believed in eternal conflict, this idea of a 10,000-year war. And Shamir basically said, we're going to flood the occupied territories with Jewish settlers to establish facts on the ground, so these will be largely Jewish populations, so we'll never have to give the land back. Now, in 1990-91, George Bush as president, Bush Sr., and James Baker as Secretary of State, said to Shamir, look, the Soviet Union has fallen, we beat Saddam in the Gulf War, you must make concessions now. You cannot keep these settlements growing. And Shamir said, well, you have to give us $10 billion loan guarantees so we can keep building. There was a head-to-head stalemate. And finally, Bush sent Baker to say to them, we're not going to give you the $10 billion in loan guarantees. At which point the message was sent to Baker, then you're not going to get the Jewish vote in 1992. Now, that was not much of a threat. Republicans didn't used to get Jewish votes. And so Baker said, F the Jews. We don't need their votes. You have to do what's right. Now, that sent a message to Shamir. So Shamir agreed to a conference. And the idea was to have a conference in Madrid. And for the first time, there would be Palestinian representation. So Lebanon was there, Syria was there, Jordan was there, Israel was there. And there were Palestinians, but they said they could not be members of the PLO because we consider them terrorists. So the meeting convened at Madrid under pressure. Shamir had no intention of reaching an agreement. But what happened at the first meeting is Shamir went through, here's what they've done to us, here's what they keep doing to us. They've done it over and over and over and over. And they expected the Palestinian representative would say, no, here's what the Jews did to us. They did this and they did that. They did it over and over and over. And instead, Dr. Haidar Abdel Shafi made the following statement. And this is the principle of Westphalia again. Keep in mind, let me just read this quote to you again, that from here as well as from there, before as well as during the war, the committed insults, violent acts, hostilities, damages, and costs should be completely put aside so that everything will be forgotten in eternity. That's the principle. So the Palestinian representative at this conference in Madrid, what I just quoted was 1648. Here's what the Palestinian representative said in Madrid. In the name of the Palestinian people, we wish to directly address the Israeli people. with whom we have had a prolonged exchange of pain. Let us share hope instead. We are willing to live side by side on the land and the promise of the future. Sharing, however, requires two partners willing to share as equals. Mutuality and reciprocity must replace domination and hostility for genuine reconciliation and coexistence. Your security and ours are mutually dependent, as intertwined as the fears and nightmares of our children. Now, this pissed off Shamir, because the guy didn't come in there and say, you guys are the bad guys, we're really the good guys. He said, let's stop the fighting. Now, Shamir dragged this out. Nothing really happened at Madrid 1. But Shamir in 1992, as he continued to build settlements, his coalition broke apart. There was an election, and Yitzhak Rabin, who had been working for Shamir to suppress the Intifada, ran against him. He made an agreement with his rival in the Labor Party, Shimon Peres, and Rabin and Peres won a virtual landslide to become the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, Shamir, 2 days before the election, I want you to listen to this speech. Members of the Stern Gang, the terrorist unit, had a memorial ceremony. And Shamir said to them, this is right before the election, we still need the truth today, the truth of the power of war. Or at least we need to accept that war is inescapable, because without this, the life of the individual has no purpose, and the nation has no chance of survival. Without war, the individual has no purpose, and the nation can't survive. After he lost, Shamir was asked, well, would you have reached an agreement? And he said, we would have carried on autonomy talks for 10 years. And meanwhile, we would have reached 500,000 people in Judea and Samaria. In other words, they would have continued to flood the occupied territories with settlers. Now, when Rabin came in, Madrid continued, but it didn't go anywhere. The Madrid process then was bilateral meetings in Washington. And so Rabin made the following statement. He said, we inherited the framework of the Madrid conference, but there is one significant change. The previous government created the tools, but it never intended to use them in order to advance peace. Now, to make a long story short, Rabin and Peres, along with Arafat, initiated the process of peace talks in Norway, in Oslo. The Norwegian foreign minister brought together representatives of the Israeli government and the Palestinians. In order for this to happen, Rabin had to repeal a law which made it illegal for Israelis to meet with representatives of the PLO. So he repealed it, and then secretly in January 1992, in December 92, negotiations began. The key person sent to run these negotiations, or coordinating the negotiations from the top for Israel, was an aide to Shimon Peres named Yossi Beilin. And along with him was a man named Yuri Savir, who was the head of the foreign ministry under Peres. The chief negotiator for the Palestinians was Abu Allah, a man named Ahmed Korei, who was a banker. But he answered to a man named Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas is the current president of the Palestinian Authority. So you had Beilin and Abbas as the key people. Now, what did they talk about in Oslo? Well, they all wanted a political agreement. The nature of the political agreement is, look, let's have two states, okay? This is the way it should be. What we have to do is figure out how to divide the land. We'll give you a state that includes Gaza and large sections of the West Bank. In return, you have to recognize Israel's right to exist. That was what the Israelis said. The Palestinians said, no problem, but there are a couple of other issues. What about the Palestinians who used to live in the old Israel, in the old territory before Israel, who left? Do they have a right to return? Secondly, what about Jerusalem? Will Jerusalem be part of a Palestinian state? And so they scratched their heads and they said, we're not going to settle this right away. Let's not sacrifice an agreement by issues that we're going to need more time to discuss. And so they postponed solution. So the political settlement said, we both recognize the other's right to exist, and we're going to continue working on these issues. Now, what do you have to do beyond that? You need something that provides this idea of mutuality, something that benefits the other. And so the Oslo Accords included something called the Economic Annexes. This was part of the Oslo Accords. It's been ignored. Those people who write on Arab-Israeli politics leave this out completely. It's almost as though it never existed. And what did these economic annexes include? Joint power development, joint water development, a Mediterranean to Dead Sea canal. Essentially, they took the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche for joint cooperation, economic development, and made this the second part of the Oslo Accord. Now, I'm not going to read you these quotes from Lynn, but from 1977 through the 80s, Lyndon LaRouche was involved in negotiations with top Israelis and top Arabs, including a 1975 visit to Baghdad, including meetings with Abba Eban, the Israeli foreign minister, including meetings with Nahum Goldman, the head of the World Jewish Congress, including exchange of letters with Shimon Peres in the mid-1980s, when Peres called for a new Marshall Plan to have peace with the Arab world. Lynn was right at the center, and what Lynn said in this is, what is it that the Arabs and the Jews have in common? He said that the peak of the Arab existence was the Islamic Renaissance. What was the Islamic Renaissance? It was when the Europeans were gouging each other's eyes out in the 9th and 10th centuries. The works of Plato were protected in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Alexandria, particularly under the Caliphate at Baghdad, and later in Persia, or what is today Iran, by Renaissance thinkers Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina, who was a doctor, but who was heavily influenced by the works of Plato. Al-Farabi, who wrote on music from the standpoint of the pre-Socratic or the Pythagoreans. So what Lynn said is this tradition of the Renaissance in the Islamic world. And then what do you have in the Jewish world? 2,000 years of survival in the diaspora. What was it that allowed Judaism to survive under hostile conditions? It was this idea that shared with Christianity and Islam that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. All human beings have that divine potential and that love of knowledge, of discovery, and the ability on top of that to constantly challenge the traditions that hold people back. One of the ways you may know this is from, and it's too bad this is how people know the Yiddish Renaissance, but through the song Tradition in Fiddler on the Roof. The attack on the idea that we survive because of our traditions. No, you have to break the traditions to advance. And that's what Sholem Aleichem and the great thinkers and writers of the Yiddish Renaissance were saying to the Jewish people: free yourself from your traditions. Be citizens of the world, not little people living in protection of a little shtetl. And so that tradition of the Platonic Renaissance for both people, because the Jews, by the way, when you think about 70 A.D., the revolt against the Romans, the Jews who led the revolt against the Romans were which ones? The ones who had been influenced by the movement of Jesus Christ and the movement of the Platonists from Greece. The rabbis of the Sanhedrin were attacking the influence of Platonism on Judaism. So you had this tradition, these two traditions that come together. And so Lynn said the basis for peace is to have an economic agreement which starts with the idea of that notion of economic justice. And I know from talking to some of the Israelis who were involved in Oslo, one of them said to me explicitly, the trade minister of the Barak government told me at the World Trade Organization meeting up in Seattle, when I said, look, these factories, these industries you're talking about creating in Palestine, are those like the maquiladoras in Mexico the slave labor plants? He said, absolutely not. We would never do to the Palestinians what the United States is doing to the people of Mexico. The only way to bring real collaboration between Israel and Palestine is to have policies that give the Palestinians a chance to raise themselves up, to use education, because there are many educated Palestinians in the Palestinian diaspora living in Los Angeles and Houston and elsewhere. So the idea of Oslo was to have economic development that for the first time would, in 30, 40 years, would give hope to the Palestinian people. And Oslo was sabotaged by the World Bank and by the Jewish extremist who murdered Yitzhak Rabin. Just as Sadat had been killed by an Islamic extremist, Rabin was killed by a Jewish extremist. Now, I just want to finish by giving you keep in mind those quotes from the Westphalia Treaty. These are a couple quotes from Rabin. His wife had written, I was looking for this quote earlier, that the Intifada made it wholly clear to Yitzhak Rabin that Israel could not govern another people. He was gradually moving by 1989 toward advocating Palestinian autonomy and self-determination. Now, Rabin said, we therefore have to make peace with the leaders of the Palestinian people, the PLO. Netanyahu and others said, you fool, you weak appeaser. These are killers. They've killed Jews. And he said, and we've killed their children. And they said, but there are enemies. You can't talk to them. And Rabin said back to him with a bit of biting irony. He said, idiot, although he didn't use that. He said, you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. And at the White House lawn, where Clinton had invited Rabin and Arafat to come for the signing of the Oslo Accord, the whole world was focused on this. Would Rabin shake Arafat's hand? The hand that supposedly had ordered the assassinations of Jews, the terrorist attacks from the Palestinians, from Fatah, from Black September, and so on. Would Rabin grasp that hand? And Rabin did. A bit reluctantly. You could see in his body language it was not his most favorite thing to do. But after he did, he made the following statement. He said, we who have come from a land where parents bury their children, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today in a loud and clear voice, enough of blood and tears, enough. And they signed the Oslo Accord. And that night at the White House, when they were toasting each other, Rabin raised his glass and said, let us toast those with the courage to change axioms. What Westphalia is about is changing axioms. In any arc of history, you can continue with the same hatred, the same grudges. You can continue to dislike the tall redhead Satan who directs the chorus and be angry at him and never improve your singing or improve the chorus. Or you can say, maybe he's got something to offer. Maybe he's thought something through that I haven't. In world politics, it's the same thing. You can't run world politics like a bunch of high school kids with grudges against the girl who stole your boyfriend or the one who cheated to become the cheerleader. At this point where we face World War III, we face nuclear war, we face a dark age, a global depression, which could lead to the destruction of 5 billion people on the planet, you have to say, enough. Let's make peace. And how do you make peace? You act in ways that will improve the conditions for those who were your enemies. You act for the benefit of the other. And you show them you're doing it because you're prepared to end the fighting. And when you're dealing with something such as the two Christian factions, Catholics versus Protestants, in the 30 Years' War, I mean, basically, you both believe in Jesus. You know, you may disagree on whether you have to have a celibate priest serve Mass to you, or whether you can just sit there and shake and bake and roll your tongue around in your head and scream out unintelligible words, but you're still doing it to Jesus. You don't kill each other over that. And the irony is that the Holy Land, which is the birthplace of the three leading monotheistic religions in the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, why should people be killing each other? The Muslims start with the Old Testament. Of course, for the Jews, it's not the Old Testament, it's the only Testament. But Moses is a prophet to a Muslim. Jesus is a prophet. Jesus wasn't the Son of God. The followers of Islam and the Jews have something they share in that. You know, they could sit there side by side and say, hey, these Christians. Hey, virgin birth, resurrection. You know, all we have to do is eat matzah. We celebrate freedom. We don't have to have a God that comes down to the earth and lives with us. So the question of peace depends not on just agreeing that we all have a certain nature, but that we are willing to act, to move the earth, to build new factories, to build centers of scientific research that will benefit people on both sides of a state line, of a nation-state's border. And that's what Westphalia is about. And so when Yossi Beilin came out after the Lebanon War, which had nothing to do with the Israelis or the Lebanese, did the Lebanese benefit from this? Their whole country was shattered. Did Israel gain from blowing up South Beirut? You don't think that the missile launchers could come back? Or if they don't have missiles, that they turn their human bodies into bombs? Asymmetrical warfare is you fight with whatever you have. You can't win a war like that. You can only win a war by changing the axioms. And the only way you can durably change the axioms is show the benefit for each side by changing the axioms. And so that's what the Westphalian principle is about. So Yossi Beilin called for a Madrid II. I started my article with the irony, Madrid I failed. There's no agreement from Madrid I. So why a Madrid II? Well, in fact, it didn't fail. It established the principle of Palestinians talking with Israelis. This led to Oslo. Oslo points the way for a real peace agreement. And the true author of that agreement is Lyndon LaRouche. And so when Lyndon LaRouche came out and endorsed Yossi Beilin's statement, it was all over the Arab press. It's all over the world press, except in our country. Because our country is being instead bombarded with the great, thrilling story of the 10-year-old murder of Jean Benet Ramsey. Forget Lebanon. Forget World War III. Did this guy kill her? What do you think? Call me and tell me what you think. You know, we have one of our organizers here who's pretty funny. He was calling people up yesterday and he was saying, listen, I need to talk to you about a couple of things. No, I don't have any time. I got to run. I'm on the road. I really don't have any time. And he said, oh, okay, well, I was going to give you the update on Jean Benet Ramsey. And the guy said, really? What do you have? So we pointed out that the guy actually had time. So we've got to wage the fight to get people to really concern themselves with those things that are important. And right now that means getting Bush and Cheney out and getting a real discussion process going of how we get out of these arcs of war and depression and create a new 50-year arc of scientific and technological progress driven by the work that the youth are doing now on Kepler and the question of how you determine an orbit of economic growth. So why don't I stop and take some questions? Yeah.
I think it was 1968 when Eisenhower was proposing development projects between...
No, the 50s.
It was in the 50s?
In the 50s, Atoms for Peace.
Okay.
Eisenhower originally proposed that. The TVA drafted a whole thing for water projects for Palestine.
And it was
that was the original idea that Lynn brought into his Oasis plan.
Right, but it was the neocons that moved in and destroyed this, particularly Wolfowitz, right, with like a paper.
Well, that was later. Wolfowitz did it. The main way Eisenhower's proposals were destroyed was that you had the 1956 Suez Crisis, where the Israelis and the Israelis and the Brits and the French attacked Egypt. And Eisenhower called up the Brits and said, you guys better get the hell out of Egypt. So there were fights during the 50s on this. But yeah, Wolfowitz later came out and wrote a paper on why this wouldn't work. And Wolfowitz today is the head of the World Bank, where he's in a position to sabotage this kind of economic development.
But the reason is to create just complete war using this part of the world to start it.
Yeah, sure. That's what Shamir said. Constant conflict. How do you define yourself as a people? The Jews for too many years were submissive, Shamir said. Now we're going to show everybody we can be just as rough and tough and nasty as the Nazis. That's the only way they're going to respect us. This is an interesting philosophical battle in this crazy movie, Munich, where an Israeli hit team is sent out to take vengeance against the Arab terrorists who were responsible for the slaughter of Israeli athletes in Munich in the Olympics in '72. And at one point, one of the Israeli operatives says, I can't do this anymore. He said, this goes against why we're Jews. We don't believe in vengeance. We don't believe in killing. We believe in creating something better. And the head of the team said, no, we have to do this. And later on, he rebelled at the end of the movie. He ended up driving a taxi cab in New York City. Yeah.
What is Lynn's involvement with Violin and Abbas, and did we have involvement in the Oslo Accords and Madrid I?
Well, in the article I wrote in this week's issue of EIR, I go through the LaRouche factor in Oslo, and there are a couple of lengthy quotes. Lynn wrote several articles that were, among them, one was in Israel and Palestine magazine, which has a heavy circulation among political elites in the Middle East. It was Max Gilon's publication. He also exchanged several letters with Nachum Goldman, the head of the World Jewish Congress, and he was also in communication with Abba Eban, who was one of the leading Israeli diplomats, a UN ambassador and a foreign minister of Israel, and then also with Shimon Peres. And so Lynn had, in 1975, he was going to give a press conference in Paris. And we had after he came back from Baghdad, dozens of countries that agreed to come to hear his proposal. And Kissinger sent out a letter above his signature saying, your attendance at LaRouche's press conference will be taken as an act of hostility to the United States. Needless to say, no one showed up. So Lynn has been involved in this. For 10 years, I had a column in the Houston Jewish Herald Voice, which was part of promoting these ideas. We've had ongoing discussions with people in Israel and people in the Arab world. We've had the same EIR has a whole series of reports on trips made by members of the LaRouche organization to Jordan, to Egypt. Lynn's visit to, Abu Dhabi for the Zayed Center to give a speech on transportation and cooperation in the Middle East. So we've been all over this. There are people in Israel who know Lynn's ideas very well and who welcomed Lynn's endorsement of the Balin plan because, look, the press in the United States is not covering this. Yossi Balin had a conference call with leading members of the American Jewish community 3 days ago that got no publicity whatsoever. What did Balin say in that? What's the biggest impediment to a new peace conference, he said? George W. Bush. And when he was asked about Bush, he said, that's a big oy vey. I don't know what we do with this guy. So Lynn's endorsement of the Balin plan is a strategic stroke. Yeah, you had a question.
I wanted to know, is Shamir still around?
I think he may still be alive. He's pretty old. But he was an honest-to-God terrorist. The Stern gang went around shooting people up in the 40s. They were responsible for several assassinations, bombings. Interestingly, they were getting money from U.S. organized crime, the Jewish mafia in the United States. Although there's some dispute over that because Mickey Cohen, the big mobster from Los Angeles, raised a huge amount of money from Hollywood guys, and the ship with the arms never got over to Israel because he said it was an old boat and it sank somewhere after going through the Panama Canal. So, it's hard to know how much of those arms ever were delivered. Yeah, Tim.
By the time of the 30 Years' War began, it seemed that most of Europe was pretty divided in terms of which regions were Protestant and which regions were Catholic.
Yeah.
And it seemed that it was pretty geographical in terms of the division. I was wondering, how it got that way, and if the Protestant Revolution was another British,
Well, it was pre-British, but look, the idea originally of Protestantism was fostered by the Aristotelian school at Padua. It was the Venetians. And they took the corruption of the church. Look, the Catholic Church was corrupt as could be. They sold indulgences. They said, look, you can screw around, you can do all these things, but if you give a lot of money to the church, you'll buy an indulgence, so when you die, St. Peter will know that you did all this good work, even though you were a crumb bun, so you'll get to go to heaven. So that's how the church raised money. And so Martin Luther opposed that as well as a whole bunch of other things. But the main disagreement Luther had was a really important philosophical, theological difference. Luther said it's faith alone that saves you. Forget works, forget charity. So he rejected Paul's Corinthians, but above all is charity, is agape, is doing the good. No, faith alone. So these were some of the fights. Now what happened is some of the princes who didn't want to pay Rome used the Protestant Catholic fight to break free, like Henry VIII. Henry VIII had a Venetian sex advisor named Zorzi. He kept trying to impregnate women to have male heirs born to him, and they kept either having no children or girls. So he had to chop off their head. The Pope said that's not acceptable for Catholics. You can't do that. He couldn't get an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. So eventually he broke with Rome. He formed his own church. He asked Thomas More to intervene for him, and Thomas More refused. And Thomas More essentially said, look, theologically I have no problem with what you're doing. I have a problem with you becoming the head of the church. And he chopped off Thomas More's head. More, who was the great ally of Erasmus, who was one of the leading Platonists in England. So there were issues, there were fights, but Henry VIII created his own religion to justify a break with Rome. And so did a lot of the German princes in the north and in Scandinavia as well. So you had the northern part of Europe became Protestant. Hamburg, which was tied to London, the Hanseatic League. Norway, Sweden had their own Lutheran churches. And the southern German princes maintained their alliance with the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs of Vienna were the head of the Holy Roman Empire. They were the enforcers. And that was also the Spanish.
So was a part of it distance from the papacy along the north, so they felt like...
Well, some of it. I mean, the church couldn't send in troops to fight them, but on the other hand, look, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation were both run by the Venetians. It wasn't about religious doctrine. It was about power. Yeah.
I know Lynn is planning on going through the Eurasian land bridge as a major portion of his September event.
You do know that?
Well, and this is the title, isn't it?
Presumably.
Well, anyway,
I never, as Lynn's spokesman, I very rarely try to guess as to what he's going to do with one of these webcasts because I'm invariably wrong.
Right.
I usually wait till afterwards and then tell people what he was going to say. Then I'm always right.
That would be a good idea. But nonetheless,
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could go through a little bit of how the Eurasian land bridge applies to the Middle Eastern situation.
Sure. Look, there's an interesting development that came out of Iran just this week. The Iranians responded to the UN Security Council +1, the Permanent 5 +1 demand, resolution, that they have to stop enriching uranium. And the Iranians said, look, now we're ready for real negotiations. And they said, but these negotiations should be on nuclear energy cooperation, but they should also be on science and technological cooperation, and they should be on regional security and development matters. A highly intriguing prospect. The Russians and Chinese immediately said, we're in, let's discuss this. The Indians agreed. The French said, well, we'll look at this. Javier Solana for NATO, for the European Union, is looking at it. The Bush White House said, we're going to study it, but we don't think it measures up to what we want. What do they want? They want a confrontation with Iran. Cheney wants a war with Iran. If Ahmadinejad came and said, I will kiss your daughter's shoes on Pennsylvania Avenue 5 times a day, they would say, we'll study it, but it's not enough. Because Cheney wants a war. So the question now is, what will happen within the larger, more and more countries moving away from the United States? Now here's the most interesting. Tony Blair's deputy, Prescott, the deputy prime minister, was quoted aloud. You know, the Brits have a very good way of speaking under their breath, and every once in a while they project a word into a microphone that ends up in The Guardian, where he said, Bush is crap. So that went out in the British press. And they asked Blair what he thinks, and Blair said, well, I wouldn't use that word, perhaps. But we're very let down. We thought the president seriously intended to have a peace in the Middle East. Now, who is Blair kidding? The polls that came out yesterday said 72% of the people in Britain think that the reason there are terrorists in Britain is because of Blair's alliance with Bush. So Blair now is distancing himself from Bush. Blair was the only serious world leader who allied with Bush. I mean, yes, the power of Grenada, the power of the Latvian forces. They sent 12 soldiers to Afghanistan. You know, the real issue was British-American alliance. And now the Brits are saying no. The Israelis are starting to say, what the hell are we getting from an alliance with this nutcase? Even John McCain, a nutcase himself, is saying Bush is a worse nutcase than I am. And there's some rumor going around, does McCain want to be part of the dump Bush efforts because he'd like to replace Bush without waiting till 2008. So there's a lot going on. So what do? Lynn's going to use the webcast on September 6th, which will be 7 a.m. in this office for everyone who's here. Put that on your calendar, September 6th. Someone was saying today, well, people won't come to that because it's so early. And then they changed it when I pointed out that same person got up at 7 o'clock to go watch Ecuador play in the World Cup. But the idea is we want people to see the webcast live at 7 a.m. 2 weeks from today. Because Lynn will be laying out a perspective on how to transform world strategic politics. If you can't get in here, it'll be on the LaRouchePAC.com website on Wednesday, September 6th, 7 a.m. Pacific time, 10 a.m. Eastern time, and 1600 hours in Germany, in Berlin, where Lynn will be speaking. I'll take one more question. Yes?
I'm trying to understand how we're really going to get Bush and Cheney out of office. Like, what's our strategy or approach to this?
Our strategy is to have cameras follow Bush around and cover everything he says. The more people see what a whack job this guy is. I mean, it's already happening. Look, a Republican former congressman, Scarborough, on MSNBC, has now had 3 times, is Bush an idiot? You saw at the beginning of the class, right? Didn't Scott show that? You have Republicans sitting there saying, well, he's really not that bad. I mean, they always say all Republicans are idiots. Well, many of them are. Some of them are good thinkers. They're the ones who are now saying Bush is an idiot. So first of all, you get people to start to say, look, the housing bubble is popping. Bush was saying the great benefit of the tax reform was more people can own homes. Now it's more people can lose homes. It didn't work. It was bogus. It was phony. We're now having the biggest popping of a real estate bubble in American history. What's Bush going to do? Blame that on Al-Qaeda? Well, those adjustable rate mortgages, those are the terrorists. They force Americans to get those mortgages. Those aren't really Americans. ARM, that's probably Arab rate mortgage. So Bush is an idiot. The more you see him. But here's what's happening. The military is rebelling. You get 22 retired generals, admirals, and top diplomats come out and say we should be talking with Iran, not preparing for war with them. They're not speaking just for retired officers. They're speaking for active duty. Cheney really was prepared to go to war with Iran, and the military said, no, we're not going to do it. Look, we just had to announce we're bringing back 1,300 Marines who are Marine reserves who are going to have another tour of duty in Iraq. Just 3 months ago, they came home. They're reserves. They're not real full-time active duty. So we don't have the military capability. We don't have the civilian Corps of Engineers on the ground capability to pacify Iraq. We can't send troops into Lebanon because they get shot at by both sides. So Bush has destroyed the United States as an honest broker. Now, does that have an impact on the day-to-day lives of people? Of course it does. Now, that brings us to the really neat part of this. Who's going to tell the American people your president's a moron? We're going to tell them. And they're going to say, hey, I think you're right. He's losing it. His press conference the other day was ridiculous. He went in and said, well, we had democratic revolutions in Lebanon, Iraq, and Palestine, and now the terrorists are controlling them. Yeah, the so-called terrorists were elected democratically. We called for democratic elections, and Hamas got elected. You can't have it both ways. You can't call for elections and then say, oh, you elected the wrong people. You don't like Hamas? Do something better than Hamas for the Palestinians. Why do the Palestinians vote for Hamas in Gaza and for Hezbollah in South Lebanon? Because they provide food, they provide shelter, they provide daycare, they provide hospitals. Does the Lebanese government do that? Does the Israeli government do it for the Palestinians? No, the Israelis are shutting those down, blowing them up. So our errors, the errors, whether it's the Israeli government, the U.S. government, our errors are creating a fertile ground for people to be recruited to asymmetric warfare against the United States. So you tell that to people. It's not that the rest of the world hates us, they hate Bush. Don't you? That's how we have to organize. Now, once more people, Bush is at 36%. Bush has lied like crazy. He's done all kinds of impeachable things. And for every one he's done, Cheney's done 10. If they finally get Bush out of there, Cheney's going to be the president with about minus 4% popularity. Cheney would be president for about 3 hours. And then that raises the question of what would be the institutional way of doing it. Now with Nixon, what happened is it became clear that Nixon had to go and Agnew wasn't the solution. So what did they do? They basically just ran the fact that Agnew was corrupt, was involved in all kinds of dirty deals. They impeached him and put Jerry Ford in as vice president. And then a year and a half later, they had Nixon stand there saying, I am not a crook. And they put him on a plane and flew him out. And he was gone. Ford became the president. Happened like that. One morning we were sitting there. I was actually driving people to a deployment site. And I turned on the radio. And they said, there will be an announcement from the White House in an hour on the fate of President Nixon. And I said, my God, he's going. An hour later, he was gone. It took 2.5 years to play out. Or 2 years. The Watergate burglary was in the June 72. The cover-up was that whole next year, and then it wasn't until August 74 that Nixon left.
How much longer did he have in his term?
Till 76. But that's the way these things happen. You have institutional forces that are rebelling against these policies. If they think that Bush is going to continue to push these policies until we have nuclear war, some of them, hopefully, are going to say, we got to get rid of the guy. Now, we've been paving the way, greasing the skids, so to speak, for them to get Bush. take them back to Crawford Ranch and say, go ahead, play cowboy for the rest of your life. We'll put a few snakes in your ranch. We'll put a few real trees there, next to the scenery. It's a little bit like the I can't remember the name of it, but the movie with Jim Carrey playing a guy who lives in the Truman Show. Yeah, that's what Bush on the Crawford Ranch is like. They got a big Astrodome with trees painted up there in clouds, and he goes riding his bike around and thinks he's a real cowboy. Herds phony cows. So that's how we get rid of him. You ridicule the guy before he destroys countries. Don't let him kill again. It's like those horror movies. Stop him before he kills again. That's what we got to do. All right, so we've got to build for this webcast. We've got to do some good work. We've got to do a lot of work. If you're a guest here, if you're not a member, feel free to sign up to go out with us, to organize people. We're going to get some announcements we want to distribute on the campuses. We want to build this big so that on every campus there are people who are going to either set up a webcast showing on the campus, or they're going to want to come here in the evening to see it. So that's the work we've got to do.
The cadre school too. Somebody mentioned that.
Yes, we've got a cadre school, which the red-haired Satan will tell you about. Come on, those. No, I'm a big backer of Nick. I was using him purely for pedagogical reasons, because some of you are very confused about him. Anyway, what's the date of the?
October 6th to 8th.
Oh, that'll be in commemoration. Actually, that'll be the 20-year anniversary of the Great Leesburg Panty Raid, where 400 armed guards, armed officials, Army, Navy, SEALs, state police tried to assassinate Lyndon LaRouche in Virginia, October 6, 1986. So that's actually quite a fitting date. It's also the 20th anniversary of the Reykjavik summit, where Gorbachev said to Reagan he wouldn't meet with him unless LaRouche was silenced. So, historic weekend. Be there. We should probably dig up some of the footage from the 86 raid and also the Reagan summit. Have a panel on what happened 20 years before. Do something like that. All right, so let's get to work.